One of the things we're talking about today is about idling. Not my kind of idling, your car idling when it shouldn't be. How motorists who do it in Brighton Hove now face a fine of up to £40 from today. The City Council says it's all about reducing air pollution. Here's Labour Councillor Tim Rokins, who chairs the Council's Environment Committee.
This is all about air quality, and a big contributor to poor air quality is vehicle emissions. When a vehicle is parked up, turning the engine off saves the emissions and the particulates.
But some motorists think it's an overreaction.
It seems a bit hefty to charge them £40 for that.
I'm not sure about the £40, but you shouldn't idle the car, no.
I think there might be other ways that we could persuade people of that rather than fining them £40 when people have got very limited resources because of the cost of living crisis.
As does Brian Gregory from the Alliance of British Drivers, who I spoke to earlier.
There's going to be pollution there anyway. There's natural ambient pollution of about 7 micrograms per cubic metre. It's just another cash grab. Air quality is better than it's ever been.
In a moment, we'll find out about reaction from taxi drivers in the city. But first of all, let's hear more from Tim Rokins, who chairs the Brighton Hove City Council's Environment Committee. I asked him about the new rules.
There's not a great deal you can do about that when a vehicle is moving, but of course when a vehicle is parked up, turning the engine off saves the emissions and the particulates. And let's remember that often when vehicles are parked up, it's often next to shops or next to a footpath or outside a school or somewhere where there's going to be people who can breathe in those emissions.
What's the evidence for this? How much more polluting are cars when they're stationary rather than when they're moving?
Well, I don't know that it's so much about how much more polluting they are. It's about that the pollution is avoidable because the vehicle isn't being used, essentially. So it's a simple sort of change that we can make. And also, remember most modern diesel and petrol vehicles, they do this automatically when they're stopped at lights and things like that. So it's really just about doing the same thing manually in older vehicles, I suppose. And it's important to say this policy will not apply when you're waiting in traffic, for example. This is really targeted at vehicles that have pulled over and stopped whilst someone's getting something from a shop or whatever it is.
OK, yes, that was my next point, actually. If you're a delivery driver, you're making multi-drops, is that a case that you might leave your engine idling? Or if you work outside and it's cold and you need to get back into your cab to warm up for a little bit, are there any exemptions?
Delivery driver thing is a good point. I mean, my sort of anecdotal experience is that delivery drivers do tend to switch their engines off when they jump out, probably because of the risk of someone jumping in the van and driving off with it.
Yeah.
But of course, one of the most problematic sources of pollution in terms of vehicles are the sort of older diesel vans and things like that, and those are often the things that are being used by delivery drivers. So that those we would definitely want to be switched off. This is all about how you enforce it, and I gave a very clear steer to the team at the time that we would not be issuing fines to taxi drivers who are sitting in a taxi rank, in sub-zero temperatures just trying to keep their hands warm. You have to apply some common sense and some human nature to how these things are implemented.
Tim Rokins there from Brighton Hove City Council. Listening to that, Andy Peters from Brighton Hove Cab Trade Association. Hi, Andy.
Good morning, Danny.
Hiya. Are you reassured about that last little bit that Tim was talking about there?
Well, yeah, that's actually the first time I've heard that reassurance, because it's great to see that it's been acknowledged that it does get cold, like when you're waiting on a taxi rank, waiting for fares. So that is good reassurance there. It's the first time I've heard that.
OK, and overall this policy is if you're sitting in a vehicle and the engine is running and you're not in traffic, so you're not actually driving it, one of the enforcement officers could tap on your window and say, could you turn your engine off? You get a couple of minutes then to turn it off, or they could then issue you with a fine. If you pay it quickly, it's £20. If it's later, £40. Overall, what do you think of the policy?
Well, OK, everybody's sort of thinking about the environment. Most cars nowadays, as has already been said, have got the engine cut off anyway. So I can't really see it happening that often. But the main thing is the reassurance for the taxi drivers sitting on the taxi ranks. Because I was going to give a challenge to all the council to come and sit in my cab during January, but the chap of that, he said it's OK for taxi drivers.
OK, but I can imagine that would be a worry for you and your colleagues in their cabs. And also the same for road workers if they've got to get back in and warm up after they've been digging a hole or filling in a pothole.
Well, yeah, because you'd be very surprised how quickly the temperature does drop when you're sitting, when you're sitting on a rank. I was out working myself last night, and you finish, you sit on a taxi rank, and the temperature drops very, very, very quickly. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to turn the engine on to warm up.
Yeah, and also pouring with rain, so you're going to mist up quickly as well, and the way to do that is have some heat in the engine to blow that through to clear your windows.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, it does steam up very, very quickly when you're just sitting on the taxi rank and you read a newspaper, mind your own business. Yeah, it does steam up quite.
I just
quite quickly.
wonder how big a problem this is, though, for for people who don't use their car for their job or their van for their job, sitting by the roadside with their engine running. I mean, is it a big problem? You think? Because actually, if you think petrol's £1.50 a litre, you're just blowing it out your tailpipe.
Well, okay, so I'm out on the road every day, and to be honest, I've got to say that it's very, very rare that you do see or hear an engine running. Perhaps the delivery drivers delivering the shopping from the supermarket. So I actually think it is actually a very rare occurrence. But can I just say that if the council are going to be spending money on sending these wardens out to check for engine idling, can they also spend the same money on getting the private cars off our taxi ranks because they block us from working? So that would be quite good if they did that as well.
Yes, maybe I think it's the same enforcement team. It's a sort of environmental enforcement team that've got a number of priorities, and this one, it will be added to them. But I see that. I see cars on taxi rank, and I think, why have you parked there? Because you are not a taxi. Do you think this problem will cure itself eventually, Andy? I don't know how big the push is for taxi drivers, whether you would think of switching to EVs yet, because actually then you could have your heater on, you're not emitting anything at the point there. So do you think that eventually this problem will solve itself?
Okay, so the question of EVs are very, very expensive to run as a taxi if they want us to go fully electric, plus the infrastructure isn't really there at the moment, although the council has tried to provide these charging points. But you can't see the other thing about an EV, and I know this because I know a couple of people who've got purely electric vehicles, including my brother. You could not sit there running the electric vehicle trying to keep warm anyway because you're just going to run the battery down.
But not as quickly as driving it. It wouldn't take up as much effort as driving it. So, yeah, I mean, obviously, it's either consumes electricity or petrol or diesel. Whichever way you're heating up your vehicle, you're going to be using some of your energy for that, aren't you?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Of course you are. And the main thing is obviously, the health and safety of taxi drivers as well. You have got to stay warm.
Yeah. All right, Andy. Nice to talk to you. Have a good year. How was Christmas and the New Year? Busy for you?
Yeah, it's okay. Can't complain at all. Can't complain. But it's now what we call the kipper season.
What's that then?
Oh, well, it's a very old saying, the kipper season, going back years and years ago, years ago, when taxi drivers couldn't had a good Christmas, but they couldn't really. The takers were down sort of during January and February. And so in those days, the only thing they could afford to eat were kippers. Because kippers at the time were actually very, very cheap. So that's why it's kind of called the kipper season.
For me, that's not a great kind of consequence for you, is it really, having kippers in January and February?
I wouldn't touch this stuff at the barge pole, so there we go.
Cheers, Andy. All the best to you. Thanks.
Cheers.
All right. Catch yourself a cab soon then. I think there's a message there from Andy. So.